Olá, pessoal, bem-vindos a mais um vídeo da nossa semana do Neurofeedback. Aqui é a Linhares, supervisor da Brain-Trainer, e eu estou aqui agora com uma pessoa muito especial, direto lá da Austrália. Eu vou entrevistar agora o Mark Darling. Mark é supervisor da Brain-Trainer International e coordenador da rede Brain-Trainer na Austrália, psicólogo com experiência em reabilitação, e ele trabalhou na área de projetos em saúde para o governo de Queensland, que é um estado da Austrália. Trabalhou por muito tempo nessa área, antes de iniciar uma prática focada no neurofeedback em consultório. O Marco trabalha com neurofeedback há mais de 20 anos, então vocês imaginam a experiência que ele tem aí com todos os tipos possíveis de abordagem de neurofeedback que vocês podem imaginar. E ele tem um trabalho muito bacana e muito conhecimento na área de autismo e das aplicações do neurofeedback para o autismo. Ele vai compartilhar com a gente aqui agora um pouco da muita experiência e do muito conhecimento que ele tem nessa área. Então, com vocês, Mark Darling. Hey, Mark, welcome to the Neurofeedback Week.
Hey, good morning, Tuan. Thank you very much. Or good morning here. I think it's afternoon where you are.
Yeah, it's evening for us here.
Thank you for the introduction. I don't know what you said, but thank you very much.
Yeah, believe me, everything I said was on what you sent to me.
Okie dokie.
So, Mark, tell us a little about your background and how you got to know neurofeedback so many years ago.
Okay, well, I'm a psychologist, and as you may have read out, my background is that I actually worked initially in the printing industry in newspapers and magazines for about 14 years. And I went to university when I was 32, and I wanted to do a psychology degree. I did that because I've actually got a son, Nathan, he's 33 years old now, but at the time he was a young boy who's quite severely disabled. He's got a genetic disorder called Angelman syndrome, and he's on the autistic spectrum. So for example, there's a lot of developmental delay for him. He has no speech at all. He didn't walk till he was 7 years old. He has epilepsy, and a range of other associated problems. So I went to university thinking I wanted to do all of the counselling courses I possibly could. I thought I would really like to help parents of children with disabilities, having a first-hand understanding of that situation. But in doing my training and learning about counselling in the psychology, of course, we started to do some neuropsychology, looking at the brain and what is happening in the brain, how that impacts behaviour. So that really grabbed my attention, and I focused on that. When I finished my degree, I worked for the university for a while. I was doing a PhD in autism, which I deferred from. Eventually just moving to be back home closer to my family. Like you said, I worked in the disability field there. But then I heard about neurofeedback. I read about it somewhere, and then I met a couple who were in a town about 1 hour's drive from where I live, and they were doing neurofeedback. So I went to look and see what it was all about. And then around the same time in 1999, I got invited to the inaugural meeting of the ISNR organisation in the Australian chapter of that organisation. Heard people like Barry Sturman, Jay Gunkelman talking there. And that really got me hooked in. So I did some training in 1999 with the old EEG spectrum, they were called at the time, who now make the EGA system. But back then it was like a single channel DOS-based system. It was very simple.
Sounds very old.
Yeah, it was. Yes, it was very old. So it actually required two entire computers. Not just the second monitor, but two full computers. fiber optic cable linked up to an amplifier, and then your electrodes from there. So that was my initial interest. I started using it. I used it with my son first. I could see, it's obviously it's not a cure, but I could see some improvements for him. And that was enough for me to start using it in private practice in psychology from early 2000 onwards.
Oh, that's great. And regarding autist population, there's a question that everyone asks every time. Does neurofeedback really works for autism?
Well, like I was saying, it's not a cure, but it definitely can train the brain and to bring about some improvements. I've seen that a lot firsthand, and have done some research as well myself in a group, and we saw considerable improvements across a number of individuals in that group. In fact, all of them. So would you like me to speak further about that?
Yeah, go ahead.
What happened with that particular situation is that I often used to get asked to speak to groups about neurofeedback. I was seeing it work with the clients that came to see me, seeing some improvements. And then I thought, one of the things I was thinking is that with autistic children, the treatment with neurofeedback, it just takes a whole lot longer. It's not a quick fix. So for some of them, it needs to be ongoing, or at least needs to go for quite a lot longer than just say someone with ADHD. So I started thinking this is getting very difficult for parents to come to a neurofeedback session 2 or 3 times a week. So in talking, I would challenge people who worked in schools that this might be a good situation to happen in a school setting. There was a school deputy and a principal sitting in an audience one day, and I didn't know they were there. This was in 2003, and they came and talked to me afterwards. They were from a special school in a place called Hervey Bay here in Queensland. So we had a chat, and we decided to run a pilot project. So they selected a group of students, six children. And of course, being a special school setting here in Queensland, that means these were the ones with the highest level of needs. So these are not higher functioning autistic or Asperger's people. These are people with, some severe developmental problems as well. So we set up and did a pilot project over 1 school term. I spent a couple of days, I trained the school staff how to run the equipment, the neurofeedback equipment. I went in and did all the assessments, and then I set up the training plans for these guys. And this is before the days when we did some type of EEG assessment or QEEG. So it was all based on questionnaires and interviews and knowledge of what the brain does to decide where to place electrodes and what sort of training protocols to use. So then once they were comfortable with using the equipment, they ran these sessions. They did 3 sessions a week across a school term. So that ended up equating to about 30 sessions that they did in that school term. So one of the things they did, they took before and after measures. They quantified the particular autistic behaviors in each of the children, and then they would measure how many times those behaviors were occurring in the classroom, and then they would look again. Each week they would measure again a predetermined window of time. How many times did their particular behaviors occur? So what we saw across the group over time is a reduction in the autistic behavior of 64% across 1 school term, which was great, and then when you look, you drill down a bit further and look at the actual individuals involved. There were two of those students had epilepsy, and we know that neurofeedback is helpful for epilepsy. Both of them stopped having seizures completely within that first term. There was someone who was nonverbal who just started to say, a few words, nothing major, but they were saying a few words. people were more on task, more focused, yeah, less emotionally volatile. There was just good improvements all around in that group. And eventually that program won a couple of awards, won a state government award and one with our federal government. And they received funding to continue the program at that point in time. So for me, that was a good indicator. And you know, my model there was not that I was running the sessions. The model was, can you train someone who's not a professional, you know, to run neurofeedback sessions, monitor them from offsite, and it still is successful? And you know, the answer, of course, was a resounding yes.
Wow, that's great to know that, because it sounds like a solution for the necessity of having so many sessions, especially for autistic people. And it's interesting to know of this idea of having schools offering that on a regular basis. And did you say it, you worked with them for one term? How long is one term?
So a school year here in Australia runs over 4 terms. So we're talking about literally over a period of about 10 weeks.
10 weeks.
Yeah, like three.
And it got this result of decreasing autism symptoms in 64%.
Yes. Yeah.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, it was great. I was really pleased with it.
Yeah. And when you deal with autistic clients, what are the biggest challenges you face, and what do you do what do you do as solutions for overcoming these challenges?
I think anyone who works with autism or knows autistic people would know that one of the biggest challenges is their sensory sensitivity. And so, yeah, a big challenge is even the fact that it's a new environment, it's a different environment, that's difficult for them as well. So I think one of the advantages of the school setting was that it already was an environment they were familiar with, working with people that they were familiar with. So that was a big help with the school program. But in terms of people coming into a clinic setting, the challenge is the sensory sensitivity. You might be trying to get a cap on their head to do an EEG assessment. They don't like it. They're trying to constantly pull it off. They're pulling electrodes off. They don't like having things stuck there. So those are the challenges. And I find often with the more severely autistic people, we don't even get to do, you know, an assessment at the start. I find that what I need to do is just somehow get an electrode on their head and start doing a protocol that I suspect will be calming for them. Because one of the biggest challenges, I think, to understand autism is you really need to understand that it's like an anxiety disorder in a sense, a very extreme anxiety disorder. And so you need to calm down their nervous system, you know, like some SMR type training, but there's some other protocols that I would use. But so for me, the things that help that can be things like I keep my old electrodes when I'm no longer using them. And so that the person, you know, they might come in with a parent. We might not even get to do any training the first time, but just get them familiar with the environment, expose them gradually to the new environment, give them the old electrodes to take home and play with so that they become familiar with them. They're not a new type of object to them. And then even when they're in there, they might do things like watching their parent have electrodes placed on their head first, or sitting with a favorite toy, a doll or a teddy bear sitting on their lap, and they're putting their electrodes onto the bear while you're putting some on their head, and it's make a bit of a game out of it. Yeah. I think those are the type of things that help.
Yeah, that's great. And regarding brain patterns, are there particular brain patterns that you find in most autistic brains, or not necessarily?
Look, they definitely differ, but I would think, you know, there's some good research out there by Dr. Robert Coben, and which shows that one of the things that you see a lot in the autistic spectrum is problems with connectivity between different brain regions. Sometimes there can be an over connectivity. It's like a hyper connectivity, or there's an under connectivity. And so if we're able to get an EEG assessment, then the goal is to try to either bring down, if there's too much connectivity, to try and bring that down. If there's not enough, to try to bring up the connectivity between those different regions. Another thing that's sometimes seen is the underactive prefrontal cortex, and that's an area in Dr. Coben's research where he uses HEG, and he compared NIR HEG with PIR HEG, two different types. One focuses, of course, on changes in temperature, and the other one changes in color. And both of them, they were fairly evenly balanced. They're both fairly successful ways of treating that area. And the thing that I would see the most, I think, though, is to do with the temporal lobe. Quite often you see an overactive right temporal lobe at T4. And, you know, as we know, below the surface of the brain, below the temporal lobes, it's where the limbic system, and particularly the amygdala, is closest to the surface. I think often what we see in people with autism is that it's really, they've got this hyper fear-based response, like I said, like an anxiety disorder, and that presents quite often as something unusual, often an overactivation, but something unusual, particularly in the right temporal lobe. So a lot of the protocols that I used, like, for example, when I was working in that school there, but over the years, the thing that I would do the most as a starting point is to train the brain at T4 and to just do frequency-based training to calm down that fear response in the amygdala. So for me personally, I know that when we talk about SMR training, we're often talking about, you know, a frequency range of somewhere between 12 and 15 hertz, then decreasing it gradually perhaps. But I think what we see, first of all, in children, the SMR range is lower than 12 to 15. In the autistic population, it's lower again. And sometimes to get a calming effect, you need to go quite lower than that. So instead of C4, which is, you know, for me, which would be what I'd do if I wanted to produce some physical calming, if I didn't have an assessment on anyone, I would definitely start at T4 and then try to get that emotional calming. I often, you know, would inhibit, say, something like 2 to 6 or 2 to 7 hertz on the bottom end, and then inhibit the entire high beta spectrum at the top, but then reward a range of about 9 to 12 hertz, and then sometimes go down if you know, I've done a session, they're still a bit hyperactive, or, you know, a bit stirred up, then go down maybe 8 to 11, 7 to 10, and just find that, you know, a sweet spot for them where they calm down emotionally.
Do you usually do that with a bipolar montage or with a monopolar one, or it varies?
Look, usually monopolar, it's just a single channel. It's a very simple protocol, and I would reference to the right ear, right ear lobe, or possibly the mastoid bone. Sometimes T4 to P4 is a helpful one as well, and it can produce some sort of sensory calming as well as the emotional. But in general, I just try to make it as simple as possible and start with some T4 training. You know, I mentioned, you know, when you can do an EEG, you sometimes see this elevated fast beta activity at T4, but you don't always. But I find that as a general rule anyway, I will start there, even if the EEG is not showing it, or, you know, they're squirming around too much and I can't even get an EEG assessment done, then I will just start there, bring it down low, and just try to bring that calming, regardless if something shows up on the assessment or not.
So the biggest priority will be almost every time on calming the brain.
Yeah, that's my priority. That's my starting point always, because, for example, you know, we've got protocols that we use, you know, to improve things like speech. And we often look at the speech production areas, which are on the left side of the brain. But my experience over the years is that people in the autistic spectrum, their brains are so over aroused that they just don't do well with any type of left hemisphere training. At least not in the early stages, you know. So in those two children who began speaking after doing some neurofeedback, we were nowhere near the left side of the brain. We were nowhere near the speech production areas or speech comprehension areas. We were just calming down the right side. And I think what's going on there is you've often got a scenario where someone can be so over aroused. It's like Maslow's hierarchy of need. You know, you need to feel safe before you can do higher order functionings. And I think that's the key thing for someone with autism. They need to feel safe. And so you're trying to decrease that fear response. And then all of a sudden, you can have situations where they start speaking, and you haven't, like I say, you haven't gone anywhere near Broca's area or Wernicke's area. You're just training the brain to calm down emotionally. So you're dealing with that, you know, the subcortical areas, bringing a sense of calm in there, and then they're able to do higher order functionings like speech, like concentrating, like paying attention to what's going on around them. And a reduction in, you know, the hand flapping and all the other sort of behaviors that they use to stimulate.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, especially if we think that the brain has a limited energy supply. So if the energy is being used for keeping the brain in the fear state or in the anxious state, then there will be no energy for upper level. How did you call that?
For higher order functions.
Higher order functions. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So our last question now. Can you tell us about a very successful case you had with neurofeedback for an autistic person?
Yes, okay. I mean, besides the ones I've mentioned some there in the school setting, and that was people with lower order functioning. But there's a guy I often think of. A parent brought their child to see me. This might be maybe about 18 years ago, and he was higher order. He had Asperger's syndrome on the spectrum, but he had out of control rages of anger, and he was 13 years old, and he hadn't been to school for more than 3 years. His behavior was out of control. He was aggressive, angry all the time, very anxious. And so we, in taking his assessment, I was suggesting to the mum that he's definitely got Asperger's syndrome, but I think he might also have some form of temporal lobe epilepsy. And again, this brings up the whole notion of what I'm talking about with the temporal lobes. But you know, often in temporal lobe epilepsy, there's no actual like a seizure as such. The outburst of anger is the seizure. So what's commonly seen in temporal lobe epilepsy is the intractable nature of the outburst of anger. It can go on for hours. Often afterwards, the person doesn't remember what happened, or they've got an altered perception of what actually took place. They can be very tired and want to go to sleep. And even during the anger outburst or just leading up to it, they can have unusual experiences, like thinking that the room that they are in is smaller than what it really is, or larger. They can have things like unusual tastes in their mouth, like the taste of when you put a battery on your tongue. Unusual smells, like the smell of sulfur. So he had some of these symptoms. I said, I think this is going to be the problem. So for me, that was a big indicator to target the temporal lobe. And we did exactly the type of protocol I was describing to you, where we targeted T4 and we just training to calm down the right temporal lobe. It was going along quite well, and I suggested to his mother that it's possible that you could see the biggest anger outburst he's ever experienced, and then after that we'll just keep training through it and you might never see one again. And now I suppose I was taking a bit of a risk in saying that, but why my thought process behind it, Siegfried Hoffmer used to talk about this sort of thing, is that when you're training a person with a seizure disorder with neurofeedback, probably what they've got before you do the training, what they might have going on all the time is these like small electrical discharges in the brain that enable the brain to just to discharge that extra electrical activity, but over a period of time it can build up, and that's when they have a big seizure. So Siegfried used to say that when you do neurofeedback training for someone with a seizure disorder, as you gradually increase the threshold at which a seizure will occur, it's probably, because those smaller discharges are probably no longer occurring, you could be building up to a bigger seizure. And so I mentioned this, and they, after about the sixth session, I think it was, 6th or 7th, they came back and she said, oh, you were right. He had the worst anger outburst he's ever had. But as it turned out, it was the very last one he ever had. So the anxiety was greatly reduced. He no longer had the outburst from the temporal lobe epilepsy. He was able to return to school. He did some study after school. And I'm still in contact with that family. That mother has gone on to do her own training, and she's now a neurofeedback practitioner herself, and she's an author of books on autism.
That's awesome.
And the son, he's about 28 or 29 now, and he's holding down a job, and he's actually in a role where he's assisting young people in the community. So it's been a really good outcome for him and for their entire family.
Oh, that's amazing. Well, we're getting to the end now. So Mark, I want to thank you so much for being with us here on the Neurofeedback Week. Really appreciate it. And so I'm going to speak Portuguese again with our audience.
Well, you're welcome. I just wanted to say you're welcome. And thank you for the invitation.
Muito bem, pessoal. E aqui terminamos com essa entrevista sensacional com o Mark Darling. E vocês que estão acompanhando aqui a gente durante a semana, continuem assistindo aos próximos vídeos da semana do Neurofeedback. Até a próxima. Tchau, tchau.